Hello folks, and welcome to the Rifle Company Butterworth podcast. My name is Sean Arthur, and I'm one of the 9,000 Rifle Company Butterworth veterans who have served at Butterworth Air Force Base in Malaysia. In this series, we're going to explore the hidden story of one of the longest conflicts in the Australian Army's military history. In duration, it was second only to the war in Afghanistan. However, long before Afghanistan, there was another long conflict that lasted from 1970 to 1989, a full 19 years. Weirdly, this conflict has been erased from the Australian Defence Force's military record. Or should I say, it was never permitted to enter the record in the first place. This was Rifle Company Butterworth, that is, the RCB, Long Defence of the Air Force Base at Butterworth, situated in northern Malaysia. In this episode, we shall investigate the enemy of the RCB, the Malaysian Communist Party, or the MCP, and we will drill down further into the Communist Terrorists, the CTs. Before we begin, let us take the word terrorists and go out for a little lexicographical stroll. Firstly, all wars involve propaganda. The last thing you want to do is to bestow any level of common human decency upon your enemy. During the First World War, the military governing authorities were horrified to discover that during the Christmas Eve of 1914, soldiers from both sides climbed out of their trenches and into no man's land and fraternised, or, to put it in less formal language, they experienced a normal human interaction with each other. The Germans, the French, and the British Tommies chatted with each other, exchanged food rations, and gave each other little gifts, such as tobacco. It wasn't a single incident either. Up and down the trench line, soldiers and junior officers mixed together in what became a brief seasonal harmony. After all, Christmas is a traditional time of peace. The various high commands were later outraged that spontaneous peace might break out amongst the common soldiery. Sometimes even mixed teams with the Hun and the Tommy on the same side. This must never be repeated. Every Christmas Eve thereafter would involve massive artillery barrages, trench raids, and wanton Yuletide death. The enemy is to be considered vile, hated, and above all, murderous. Because it becomes difficult to shoot someone who you can readily identify with. Both the East and the West, and the political right and the political left, used and abused the word terrorists. They still do. And this was the case of us and our enemy, the CTs. Am I saying that the CTs did not commit acts of terror? No, of course not. They certainly did. But so too did the British and the Malaysians. To be a communist insurgent, even without killing anybody, was to commit a capital offence in itself. If you were caught with a weapon on your person, even one that you had never used before, it was gallows for you. A CT might murder a non-compliant plantation owner, for instance, and of course that's an ordinary act of terrorism, straight up. But the British in the first Malaysian emergency and the Malaysians in the second emergency would capture a CT, have a brief trial, and then sometimes take that enemy soldier out and just hang them. Chen Peng, the communist leader, claimed, and not verified by me, that the British hanged over 200 of his soldiers, including women. So if you were to squint your eyes tightly, you might have trouble discerning a difference between the two, because the outcome certainly caused terror to the victims. In fact, both sides were soldiers out there in the bush, trying to kill each other. But only one side had state protection. The other side were outlaws, and that status was decided by your enemy. For the most part, the CTs at least tried not to kill non-combatants, if only for selfish reasons. They didn't want to create anti-communist informers. That is death for any insurgency. They had enough experience in the Second World War against the Japanese to understand that if you treat villagers the right way, they will usually look the other way when questioned by the government. The Malaysian Communist Party went even further. The deep jungles where the CTs tended to operate were also the Badlands, inhabited by bandits. The bandits were simply common organised crime cartels, and by the 1970s they had established drug routes stretching out from the Golden Triangle of Burma, China, Laos and Thailand. One of the first things the CTs did when they moved into a new jungle hideout area was to tell the local crime lords to go take a very long walk or else. The Thai or Malaysian governments could not offer the local forest villages security. Isolated police stations in the border districts were soon attacked by the CTs. So police were rather reluctant to stray into the jungle, at least very far. But the CTs could provide such security protection to the jungle kampongs against banditry, and they did so. The villagers learned that having these armed guys around was not necessarily the worst thing in the world for them, even if they were subsequently taxed for food and occasionally labour. For reasons of habit and common usage, I will continue to refer to the enemy as CTs. For one thing, they did easily turn to terrorism when they found it beneficial. I'm just saying that perspectives can turn on a dime, and the counterinsurgency operations are not for the faint-hearted. As the old saying goes, a terrorist is a guy with a bomb, but one who doesn't have an air force to drop it. I don't remember getting detailed briefings about the CTs as a separate enemy. At any stage of my pre-deployment training, partly because Australia had been engaged in revolutionary insurgency warfare for a couple of decades at this point. You might say that our military was quite expert at fighting it, that is, counter-revolutionary warfare. Our officer corps was probably one of the best educated military forces at fighting communists at the time, and this was even the case before Vietnam. The Malaysian Communist Party were classic Maoist revolutionaries, and the strategies that they employed were fairly universal by design. The CTs lived off the land when they needed to, and they enlisted civilian population when they needed to. They used terror if they had to. They attacked only at a time and place of their choosing, and only when it was strategically to their advantage. They generally withdrew to safety after taking military action to prevent annihilation by a superior force. They used only what they had on hand. They didn't have much in the way of war stores, but what they did have, they deployed ingeniously. Lastly, they were incredibly patient. The CTs were masters at camouflage and ambush. They did not see the rainforest as a hostile environment. To them, it was vital concealment in their home. Their greatest strength was their endurance and their willingness to suffer for the cause, and suffer they did. They had no hospitals in the jungle, at least none that a Westerner would recognise. Drugs were often basic or non-existent. If seriously wounded, they understood that a likely outcome would be a lonely forest grave. And for a Buddhist, this was culturally frightening, because paying respects to one's ancestors is a central theme to their religion. Families are obliged to go visit the grave, and dying in the middle of a jungle, you are cast off from every anchor you knew. So in fighting a Maoist insurgency, a Western army must by necessity also adopt many of the characteristics of that insurgency yourself. It stands to reason that if such tactics were designed to draw the fangs from a conventional army, that employing conventional army methodologies was counterproductive. For Western armies, counterinsurgency is all about returning to a level playing field, and only keeping those conventional tactics that offer you an advantage in your new environment. Say, keeping mortars, artillery and air support, and perhaps medical care in reserve. A Western army must lose the security of a large, firm base and for long periods. A Westerner must also decline the safety of big battalions and shun any thought of personal comfort. You need to sneak about in the enemy's preferred jungle playground and remain completely dark. This is why the Australian Army is so strict about fire discipline. A single accidental rifle shot in the distance, and you might as well pack up and go home. The communists would have disappeared from the area of operations. One must move covertly through the bush and remain unseen. Instead of being ambushed yourself, you become the ambusher. For a Western soldier, it means dodgy hygiene, terrible constipating food, and living in the harsh elements without cover for extended periods. The jungle also introduces health problems like foot rot and respiratory issues, and also physical non-battle casualties like broken limbs. The wet environment is also hell on weapons and equipment, and resupply becomes a problem and therefore a rarity. Every single physical contact with your supporting elements back home is an advertisement for your location, so you must man-pack everything you need to survive for long periods. The weight of 10 days' rations and ammunition in combination with humidity, wet backpacks and webbing means cutting the skin on your shoulders to shreds. That is counterinsurgency operations in a nutshell. However, that is how you win against the CTs, by stealth, not tanks. Us sitting in a modern and urban airbase, the RCB was denied all this. We surrendered our most effective and time-honoured winning strategy against insurgency. Instead, the RCB was employed statically in a highly visible location, and we voluntarily gave up all advantage of ground domination to the enemy. The CTs might have been sitting 100 metres away from the aircraft flight line, and we would have no way of knowing that they were even there. That is why patrolling, or even driving at night through an empty airbase, gave you the heebie-jeebies. There was absolutely no concealment. The reassurances today from the Defence Department that the Australians had no official enemy back then offered zero consolation. You could sometimes almost feel the AK foresight on the centre of your back. It was extremely disconcerting. Back to the Malaysian Communist Party as a separate entity and not the generic boogeyman. I mentioned previously that we received countless briefings about the counterinsurgency operations before we deployed to Malaysia. It wasn't just briefings either. Our entire military methodology in the 1970s was still mostly stuck in the Vietnam era. Most of our training back home involved sneaky jungle work. But following the end of the Vietnam War, after 75, things were slowly changing. Canberra was once again, for the first time, looking towards conventional warfare, at least limited conventional warfare. Australia was just too small for anything beyond boutique land operations. But the Southeast Asian region lacked the rolling, empty croplands of Western Europe. We still needed to keep an expert foothold in both types of warfare, and we still do. Our SAS and infantry regulars today can comfortably operate with equal efficiency in either, say, the Philippine rainforests or the Afghanistan deserts. Armies that can't adapt usually end up under the heel of those who can. While we understood counterinsurgency operations very well, looking back, we didn't really understand our CT enemy outside the cookie cutter of generic Maoist doctrine. We assumed that all revolutionary military movements were identical, and in most cases, they all did follow a very similar track by design. However, every country and every political movement has unique push and pull factors. Each revolutionary party experiences a unique culture, a unique background, adversary, and history. The 1960s were a turbulent time for communist movements, but to assume that all such conflicts were identical would be very, very wrong. I'll try not to get too deep into the weeds, but the Malaysian Communist Party did not just pop into existence in 1968. It had a long and winding path going back to the 1930s. Chen Peng joined the Malaysian Communist Party in 1940 as a 15-year-old. Almost immediately, he became embroiled in the Pacific War. By the age of 18, he became a significant figure in the Malaysian People's Anti-Japanese Army, the MPAJA. After the fall of Malaya to the Japanese, he would also become a key liaison figure with the British Force 136, which was a tiny commando unit that were operating behind the Japanese lines. Chen Peng was still only a teenager when he became the head of his party's activities in his home Malaysian state of Perak. Immediately following the Japanese surrender, Chen Peng was appointed to the party's Central Committee and ultimately his party's policy-making Politburo. 2 years later, at war's end, he was formally named the MCP Secretary General its highest ranking figure. He was only 23 years old at the time. The following year, in 1948, the first Malaysian emergency commenced, and Chen Peng became the British Empire's most wanted man. Chen Peng would become embittered by how he and his fellow fighters were later characterised by the British during the emergency. He claimed that the British first considered him and his guerrillas to be sterling chaps when fighting against the Japanese. But when using the same tactics as he later used against the British, he became some sort of Malaysian Hitler. His change of status to that of terrorist was directly related to his becoming an enemy to the British, and not because his troops operated any differently. If he was a terrorist to the British, he should also be a terrorist to the Japanese, but the British didn't consider him to be then. During the Pacific War against the Japanese, they weren't murderers or terrorists. They were war heroes. In fact, the British awarded Chen Peng English military campaign medals after the war for his fight against the Japanese and for assisting the British forces. I'm not sure if many of my old RCB comrades are aware of this, but the British also awarded him the Order of the British Empire, the OBE, for services rendered. How many holders of the OBE would later be called terrorist rebels by the same empire? Probably not too many. At heart, and at the very beginning, it was the British colonial system and its inherent racism that caused Chen Peng to take up arms. To be a non-white person in 1930s Malaya meant hardship, slave work and poverty. The empire, no matter how great, did not serve the likes of him. Communism, with the promise of equality, was a powerful drug to the permanently downtrodden Chinese. It has been identified, quite correctly, by many that one of the problems with the MCP fight was that they became associated as a party of Chinese. It just wasn't broad enough to sustain interest amongst the masses. However, in the early days, this wasn't the case at all. Because all races in the British Empire were beneath the British table, the Chinese, the Indians, and the Malays were all considered inferior by the Brits. All the local peoples, except perhaps for the native princes, were exploited for their labour. This would change in time. Chen Peng's message of inclusion was so enticing that even a couple of hundred Japanese soldiers would desert their army and become guerrilla fighters themselves. Try and get your head around that. The most honour-bound troops in the world, the ones who refused to surrender to Western armies when surrounded, actually joined the forces of the Malaysian Communist Party. Immediately after the war, the British returned to their old colonial haunts, as did the French in Vietnam. Both nations had hopes of just resuming business to where things had been left off before the Japanese arrived. The old and the new world were in desperate need of raw materials to rebuild after their war losses. However, the colonies had seen their former white masters humbled by an Asiatic race. It really made them think, why do we have these guys over here bossing us around? Why are we letting them take away all our wealth? What's the deal with that? On their return, the British did make some concessions at first. As Malaya was the home of the Malays, they made efforts to create a Malayan middle class. Some jobs of a certain calibre were offered to Malayans, particularly in the public service, and occasionally in the middle management. Native talent was rewarded with a Western education, sometimes an English military education, and perhaps officer positions in the Malay regiments. All these were small steps, but they were in the right direction. Not all races received favoured treatment. Those of Chinese and Indian heritage were left out in the cold as they ever were. Real electoral freedom was not only non-existent, about as likely in the future as flying to the sun. Discontent pushed many Chinese into a socialist political system. One that, if handled differently, may not have been of interest to them at all. This is how the Malaysian Communist Party started to turn from a universal Malay-type organisation, one with broad economic appeal, into a predominantly Chinese party. The Chinese were the last ones standing in the begging line. The same process was churning away for the British in India, but with a different ethnic caste and different nationalist motivations. I'm simplifying things to the point where a professional historian would have bitten through the stem of his or her pipe, but this is all broadly true. During the Japanese occupation, the British at first attempted to call the shots to the MCP and tried to run the war remotely through established communist military organisations. But the Brits had no military units of their own in country, or none that weren't already in captivity. The communists were having none of it. They fought their war their own way. Their primary utility to British forces, apart from small combat operations such as ambushing and blowing up Japanese stuff, was surveillance. The Malaysian Communist Party units took up secret stations near ports or watched Japanese transport vessels and submarines transiting close through Malay waters. Many of these Japanese ships would have had bad endings thanks to MCP intelligence. But Chen Peng was up front. He knew that the British was using him and his party for their own ends. Fair enough. So he would use them later in return. It was a transactional relationship on both sides, and both sides knew it. Although genuinely earned, the awarding of an OBE by the British after the war was partly an effort to lure this talented man away from the dark side. It worked for a great number of other insurgents in the party. That and these little monetary rewards on the side. The MCP was particularly prone to defectors, informers and outright traitors. It was a very tough life, living rough in the jungle. So the war in the Pacific ended, and the British at first believed that they just might pick up where they left off in 1942. They were mistaken. In the case of Malaya, Chen Peng and his guerrilla fighters didn't spend the last 3 years fighting the Japanese for nothing. The MCP were the only military force to successfully do so on the peninsula. They didn't do so just to return to the life of a British coolie for their white masters. That wasn't going to happen. The first Malayan emergency started as a whimper rather than a bang. According to the British, it started with the deaths of 3 planters in Sungai Siput in June 1948. But the violence had been simmering for a long time before that. In putting down demonstrations in October 1945, the British troops fired into an unarmed crowd, killing 10. These 10 were killed in the same town where the 3 planters were later murdered. Also, 3 more civilian demonstrators were killed in a similar incident at Ipoh that same year. Chen Peng said that shooting at white, unarmed demonstrators protesting for better working conditions with live ammunition would have been unthinkable in Cornwall or Yorkshire. Having Asian skin seemed to be the only difference to the British. Newspapers reporting the circumstances were shut down by the British, and things began to slide downhill from there. At the time, the British Military Administration, or BMA, which was the military government at the time, deployed a very heavy hand in dealing with civilian protests, as such controlling organisations typically and historically always have. Soldiers rarely make the best governments. They are famous for mishandling civilian sentiments. It is not my intention to delve far into the details of the first Malayan emergency, but you get the flavour of how it started to form. It was bad handling on both sides, but in judging these early events, we have the benefit of hindsight. The young British subaltern who, after having read the Riot Act in English to angry yet uncomprehending Chinese workers, after ordering them to disperse back to their homes, had no inkling what he was contributing to in the next few seconds. Did he know, once the gun smoke had cleared in the town square, that he was at the very start of a violent conflict that was to last over 40 years and take approximately 12,000 lives? Certainly not. But a mighty oak tree just doesn't appear out of nowhere. It comes from a tiny single seed. The MCP does not really make a distinction between the first and second military emergencies. The Communists, of course, realised that it was vastly outnumbered by 1959. The Western armies had been very successful in raiding and ambushing the CT jungle hideouts. In the war against the Japanese, the CTs operated in 30-man platoon-sized units, and they could easily take on the isolated small Japanese patrols sent to hunt them down. Nor did the Japanese employ aircraft reconnaissance, because those assets were urgently required elsewhere. The Anglo armies of the emergency, however, sent out much larger forces in hunting the CTs. They also utilised recon flights to locate the hidden jungle camps. The Commonwealth forces operated in the bush at platoon strength, which was at least 3 times the size of Japanese patrols. So the CTs decided to take on the Westerners in company-sized units of 100 men. In the event of a surprise encounter with the enemy, the CTs would be better able to fight their way out of trouble. But over time, there was no doubting the truth. The Communist forces were being fractured and isolated right across the region. Chen Peng was a guerrilla fighter of the old school. One time, British Lincoln bombers attacked his own base camp and several of his bodyguards were killed. He escaped. By 1960, he knew that it was only a matter of time before he was killed or captured. He knew that an SAS hit team would probably be sent across the Thai border one day, with or without legal permission from the Thai government. Chen Peng was a very senior official in the MCP, and he could not allow the propaganda victory that his death or capture would give to the Brits. He departed for China, and the Malaysian emergency wound down. However, the war was not over. The MCP treated the next 8 years as a regrouping period. Most of the British and Australian regiments went home, a job well done. The MCP leadership in Beijing started to rebuild the committed communist cadres in the Thai Malay jungle. They recruited and trained pretty much unnoticed. The process was slow, but revolutionary warfare understands that setbacks are to be expected, and change was in the air. Vietnam was proof of that. As the 1960s were coming to an end, the war in Vietnam was inching closer in favour of the Viet insurgency. China had always been a bit lukewarm in supporting the MCP insurgency, in practical terms anyway. While China did supply them with arms and equipment, it was of the small kind, such as assault weapons, ball ammunition, lightweight rockets, and medical supplies, rather than, say, artillery. However, in the late 1960s, the MCP approaches went out to the North Vietnamese government, and valuable friendships were established. In time, Vietnam would become the MCP's primary military supplier, though China was still firmly backing them on the international stage. The time for the MCP Second Act was about to commence. The Australian decision to send only a single rifle company to Butterworth made no tactical sense. In fact, it went against NATO doctrine that an attacking force must always outnumber a defending unit by a factor of 3 or more. RCB was a company of 100 men, but that number was evenly matched by our typical communist enemy. The CTs operated in the same number and roughly the same organisational structure as we did in Butterworth. While the CTs might not necessarily win in a surprise encounter, it did not mean that the Australians would win either. A probable outcome of an attack on the airbase might well be a draw, followed by a CT withdrawal. But what does draw mean in lives lost? In any case, it was a recipe for mass Australian casualties, even if we did win. 100 guerrillas armed with automatic AK-47s could put a substantial amount of aimed lead in the air. Australian soldiers were protected by green shirts and little else. What's worse, out in the jungle, the CTs had a total force of a couple of thousand plus. Meanwhile, us, the rifle company, still only numbered 3 platoons. We could draw upon the Malaysian Armed Forces, but this would take time to organise. As a defending unit for the airbase, we could only rely upon our own resources, no matter what was thrown at us. A surprise CT hit-and-run attack, if determined, might get very ugly very quickly. To really have an impact on the CTs, we would need to send troops out into their jungle hideouts. To do that, we would need many hundreds of Australian soldiers in the bush, but instead, we were experimenting in security on the cheap. As to weapons, each side, both us and the CTs, were generally restricted to basic infantry weapons. The standard Australian Army assault rifle at the time was a 7.62mm self-loading rifle, the famous SLR. The CTs had a number of assault rifles, but the standard communist weapon of choice being the AK-47. The SLR was a good and powerful rifle and well liked by the diggers, but was slightly edged out in utility by the AK-47. Officially, the SLR had an effective range of 300 metres. The AK had an effective range of 400 metres. The SLR was a single shot only, while the AK was either single shot or full automatic. The SLR's magazine capacity was 20 rounds, the AK's was 30. The Australian troops were not at all fazed by whatever slight superiority the AK might have over the SLR. For one thing, Australians valued marksmanship, and we were better trained than the insurgents, who were operating secretly in the jungle. Each rifle section had 4 SLRs. Each rifle section also had 2 5.56mm M16 assault rifles. These were also popular assault weapons due to their light weight, which was always a consideration to an infantryman weighed down with so much gear. You could also carry more ammo with an M16, so you got more bang for your buck. Unlike the SLR, the M16 could be fired at full auto, but we were mostly discouraged from doing so. Aim shots were our goal. The rifle team also carried an M203, usually by the number 2 Scout. The M203 was simply an M16 with a 40mm grenade launcher attached underneath the primary barrel. Lastly, each section carried the famous M60 GPMG. The M60, or the Pig, as it was popularly called, fired 7.62mm belt-fed rounds and had a devastating cyclic rate of 500 to 550 rounds per minute. I have seen this ugly thing saw through a massive gum tree more efficiently than a chainsaw ever could. The experience taught me that one must never expect a tree to act as effective cover, no matter how big it seemed to be. Technically, the M60 wasn't a crew-served weapon, as one person could effectively operate it, but our doctrine employed both a number 1 and number 2 gunner. The number 2 managed the ammunition supply to the gun, spotted targets and changed barrels as they overheated. This allowed the number 1 gunner to concentrate on laying suppressive fire in the enemy's direction. The third member of the gun team was the section second in command, the 2IC. Technically, the 2IC was in charge of the gun team, but no self-respecting gunner would await direction from the 2IC. It was a point of pride to have those bullets flying out seconds after enemy contact. In truth, all our weapons were pretty clapped out after half a dozen years' service in Vietnam, particularly the M60. The innards were pretty much worn out and very loose, and because of this, stoppages were frequent. Gunners were forever being screamed at for lack of fire, as they continually had to clear the jams and reload the ammo belts. I was a gunner myself, though only after my RCB deployment. The thing weighed 12 kilos, loaded with a 100-round belt. And you carried the bulk of that dead weight on a sling around your neck. Running with the M60 was an exercise in pain. It is no wonder that ex-soldiers have so many medical complaints. If you trip over a log while running with this hefty object, it will leave you with a lifelong souvenir about the knees or ankles. That, and many opportunities to visit medical centres throughout the rest of your life. Gunners typically crashed onto their belly all the time, and sometimes even intentionally. The Australians suffered from one disadvantage that our enemy didn't. The CTs had a form of aerial weapon, which, although unwieldy and fairly inaccurate, was devastating in its destructive powers if it hit something. Chen Peng himself referred to them as homemade mortars, which, okay, he could call them that. But it was a weapon that was first used on the European battlefields in Waterloo in 1815 and was pretty much in the same basic form as it is now. It was the rocket. Rockets were first used by the Chinese as actual weapons in the Battle of Kai Feng Fu in 1232 AD against the Mongol invaders. And even then, centuries ago, they were not entirely different from that of today. They consist of a warhead, a body for carrying some sort of solid fuel, fins for rough guidance, and an ignition system. 1,000 years ago, they were lit with a match. Today, they are electrically fired, but they are still the same functional weapon. The CTs typically use the 122mm BM-21 Grad P, a single-round man-portable rocket, which had been used extensively and very effectively by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops. The Grad P had a 20-kilogram explosive warhead and a range of 12 kilometres. They were flexible in use and could be fired by bamboo launchers and fired in batches, which is why Chen Peng probably referred to them as homemade mortars. You could man-pack a bunch of these rockets to a suitable location, build the launcher on the spot out of cut bamboo lengths, fire them off, and be on your way before the first rocket landed. They were a ground-to-ground weapon, a favourite of the communist soldier for their special ability in destroying personnel and sensitive equipment over a wide area, such as airfields. The CTs used them extensively in remote attacks on airfields and other military bases, and there was very little defence against them. The only true defence was to respond to every attack very aggressively, but only after the event. The CTs always landed the first punch. You would have to force the CT crews to learn that shooting these things off meant paying a price. While we, the RCB troops, didn't fear rockets as much as regular infantry attacks, a grunt would have to be very unlucky to be hit by a rocket. The RAAF were obsessed by the possibility of a rocket attack, and for very good reasons. Firing off 20 of these dangerous things from 5 kilometres away might destroy both of our Australian Mirage squadrons on the ground in about 5 minutes. They needn't be super accurate either. Aircraft are extremely susceptible to rocket attacks. Even a near miss of 70 metres could still destroy a fighter jet. And another thing about air bases, there are aviation fuel and explosives just sitting about in every direction. Interesting side note, the word grad in the name of the rocket BM-21 Grad P means hail in Russian. And that's how they would have landed on the airbase during a quick attack. Our deployment, let me remind you, was described by the Australian Defence Department as a boring, peaceful training tour. Yet the RAAF commander in charge absolutely refused to allow more than 1/3 of the Army RCB force off the base for any reason. Without the RCB on site, the Air Force would have had its furniture rearranged by the CTs, as they had done so on so many other Malaysian bases. They had rocketed the Minden barracks, for instance, several times, and that base was only a couple of kilometres away, so why not Air Base Butterworth? Unlike our friends, the CTs, the RCB had no indirect fire support of any kind. Back home, and normally, we would have had the integrated battalion mortar platoon to call upon, and the even bigger calibers of the 105mm artillery batteries. For obvious reasons, we couldn't shoot back with the big guns, even if we had them. We were on an airbase filled with either delicate stuff or exploding stuff. And we were also surrounded by Malaysian civilian homes, shops and villages. Besides which, the CTs had a very big target to aim at, even with their rather inaccurate flying bombs. Yet our target was incredibly small and almost entirely invisible. One last thing of note about our enemy, the CTs. As I said previously, we the Australians understood revolutionary warfare very well and how to counter it. But we did not truly understand the personality of our CT enemy. For a start, at the time I was in Malaysia, I believed that Chen Peng himself was still out there in the jungle facing us, hiding in the rain and plotting his next move. this was not the case. The man himself had departed Malaysia 15 years previous to my time of service at RCB. He was long gone and living in China, and was hardly ever involved in running the war, at least not directly. By my time in the mid-70s, the CTs operating from the jungle were not listening to the likes of Chen Peng anymore. He had lost control of many of his insurgent fighters. Apart from the very few who Chen Peng could control directly, there were two other main spin-off factions. They were the Revolutionary Faction, or the RF, and the Marxist-Leninist Faction, the ML. Most of these CT enemy companies were now acting independently, and they had been developing an intense distrust of each other. What happened was that some of their number had turned and had become government informants. This news got out, and the CT units discovered that they could not trust anyone anymore, even each other. Perhaps all the other guys were traitors. And to every CT unit, it was, well, the other guys who were probably the traitors. If any sort of misfortune befell a CT unit, it was blamed on somebody. If the security forces just got lucky and ambushed a communist company, it must be due to treachery. Conspiracy theories in the CT units ran like wildfire. It wasn't long before accusations began to fly, and then the middle of the night arrest started amongst the insurgents. Our enemy started devouring itself. A quick CT investigation would begin, and an even quicker trial was called, and then a sharp execution in the jungle soon followed. This happened over and over again. An unexpected and surprisingly secondary effect of this disunity was that the CTs became even more aggressive as the war went on. It turned into a patriot competition between the various CT companies. One would think that all this disunity would make the RCB situation safer, but the opposite is true. It just made the unpredictable enemy even more unpredictable. Years later, Chen Peng, when trying to surrender at the later part of 1989, spent an extraordinary amount of time just trying to get the different factions to agree to something. They were completely furious with each other about how different commanders had executed their men for being traitors. In truth, most of the insurgents were innocent of the charges and falsely accused. So the CTs increasingly became more radical as time went on, and they took more chances. By 1989, and just before surrendering, the CTs were fighting both the Malaysian security forces in the south and the Thai security forces in the north simultaneously. Just like the First World War, the closer the conflict came to ending, the more the violence ramped up. And then on one December day in 1989, it all suddenly stopped. In the next podcast, I will get into the official Australian investigations of the RCB service, and particularly the 2023 DHAT Tribunal. I will explain how that, for the most part, these inquiries have been self-serving, usually illogical, and how they played fast and loose with established facts. Thank you for listening to the RCB podcast. We are privileged that you have taken an interest in this part of our military and political history, as so very few have. We have nothing on our side other than public opinion to help us. Nobody in government cares. This has been a production of the RCB Veterans Group. The podcast was written and produced by myself, Sean Arthur. I would especially like to thank the tireless efforts of the RCB Research Group, who have brought a level of professionalism in driving our collective efforts to the government's doorstep. I would also like to thank the RCB Veterans Group, who have been taking on the veteran fight for a very, very long time, especially at a period when the RCB space was mostly vacant. Both veteran groups have shown no lessening of resolve, even as the years roll on. And lastly, with continual thanks to the 9,000 Australian Army veterans who served at RCB between the years 1970 and 1989. Thank you for listening.